Perhaps someone who couldn't even win his own party's primary wouldn't understand the complexities of real intelligence work. Adam Schiff said it with a smug smile, certain he had just demolished Ted Cruz in front of millions of television viewers. But Cruz didn't flinch, didn't get defensive. Instead, he adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and smiled, the smile of a man who had just watched his opponent dig his own grave. "You mentioned legal experience." Cruz said, his Texas drawl slow and deliberate, as if explaining something to a child. "Well, let me share a little bit about my career. Harvard Law magna cum laude. Law clerk for Chief Justice William Rehnquist. 9 cases argued before the Supreme Court, 5 of them won. And a thick manila folder containing enough evidence to turn an impeachment manager into a federal criminal." Adam Schiff had just called one of the most qualified constitutional lawyers in America a small-town lawyer. He was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his life about underestimating an opponent. The Senate Intelligence Committee hearing room buzzed with electric anticipation as C-SPAN cameras rolled live to millions of Americans hungry for constitutional accountability. What they were about to witness would become the most-watched constitutional oversight hearing in American history, surpassing even the Watergate proceedings in both legal significance and pure political destruction. Senator Ted Cruz entered the chamber with the quiet confidence of a constitutional scholar who had spent months preparing for this moment. His weathered leather briefcase contained enough documented evidence to end political careers, but his unassuming demeanor, simple navy suit, wire-rimmed glasses, and that distinctive Texas bearing stood in stark contrast to the explosive nature of what he was about to unleash. Meanwhile, Adam Schiff swept into the chamber like he owned it, which in many ways, as the former Intelligence Committee chairman, he felt he did. After years of wielding investigative power in Washington, he carried himself with the imperial bearing of someone accustomed to destroying opposition through sheer force of prosecutorial will. His expensive suit, perfectly styled hair, and entourage of former committee staff sent a clear message he was here to obliterate this upstart senator from Texas. "Ladies and gentlemen," Chairman Marco Rubio announced as the room fell into anticipatory silence, "we're here for constitutional oversight hearings on Intelligence Committee operations and accountability. Today, the American people get the transparency they've been demanding about how their most sensitive government institutions have been managed." Schiff immediately seized the initiative, his voice dripping with California superiority and barely concealed contempt for what he viewed as constitutional theater by conservative politicians. "Senator Cruz, I understand you have some legal background." Schiff began, his pause deliberate and calculated to maximize the condescension. "But perhaps someone who couldn't even win his own presidential primary wouldn't understand the complexities of serious intelligence work." The liberal reporters in the gallery nodded approvingly, their pens ready to chronicle what they expected would be Schiff's intellectual demolition of a simple conservative politician who dared question the former Intelligence Committee chairman. "This isn't some undergraduate debate society or small-town courthouse." Schiff continued, his voice gaining confidence with each dismissive word. "This is national security work where serious people make serious decisions based on serious intelligence." He gestured dismissively at Cruz's modest appearance and Texas demeanor. "Maybe you should leave the complex legal analysis and constitutional interpretation to those of us who've actually run major congressional investigations and understand how real prosecutorial work gets done." The gallery supporters smirked openly at Cruz's expense. This was exactly the kind of coastal elite intellectual superiority they loved to see deployed against conservative politicians who dared challenge the establishment. But Cruz sat quietly in his chair, that patient Texas smile never wavering. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses slowly, completely unruffled by the attack. His demeanor was that of a man who had heard far worse from far more qualified legal opponents. "Well now, Mr. Schiff," Cruz began, his Texas drawl carrying across the chamber with a new authority, "I do appreciate your assessment of my qualifications and your thoughts on my legal background." He paused, letting the moment build with the timing of a master constitutional advocate who had argued before the highest court in the land. "You mentioned legal experience and investigation credentials. Let me share just a bit about my legal career since you brought it up." The chamber's atmosphere shifted perceptibly as Cruz's words carried the weight of someone about to deliver a legal education. Harvard Law School magna cum laude, Harvard Law Review, Cruz continued with devastating politeness. After graduation, I had the honor of serving as a law clerk to Chief Justice William Rehnquist of the United States Supreme Court. Schiff's smugness began to evaporate as he realized he had just walked into a constitutional trap of massive proportions. Following my clerkship, I served for 5 years as Solicitor General of Texas. Cruz continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had defended constitutional principles at the highest levels of American government. In that capacity, I argued 9 cases before the United States Supreme Court and won 5 of them, including landmark cases defending the Ten Commandments Monument and the Pledge of Allegiance. The transformation in the chamber was immediate and total. The man Schiff had tried to dismiss as an intellectual lightweight had just revealed himself to be one of the most qualified constitutional lawyers in American government, with experience arguing before the Supreme Court that dwarfed anything in Schiff's prosecutorial background. "But you know what, Mr. Schiff," Cruz said, reaching for his briefcase with the deliberate precision of someone about to deliver constitutional justice. "Credentials aren't what matter here. Truth matters, constitutional principles matter, and the oath of office matters." His eyes met Schiff's across the chamber with the intensity of a constitutional scholar who had come armed with documented evidence and wasn't planning to leave any legal survivors. "Now then," Cruz continued, opening his briefcase with a soft click that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent chamber like the sound of a constitutional coffin being opened. "Let's talk about those lies you told the American people about Russia collusion and how you turned the Intelligence Committee into a political weapon against a sitting president." The constitutional destruction was about to begin. Cruz opened his first folder with deliberate precision, the sound of rustling papers echoing through the suddenly silent chamber like the opening notes of a constitutional funeral march. The folder was thick-bound with special counsel seals and marked Durham Report, official findings in bold red letters that seemed to pulse with legal significance. "Mr. Schiff," Cruz began his Texas drawl, now carrying the weight of constitutional authority, "you mentioned that I should leave serious legal work to those who understand investigation. Well, let's examine your investigative work through the lens of an actual investigation conducted by a real prosecutor." Schiff straightened in his chair, attempting to project the confidence that had just been shattered by Cruz's constitutional credentials. "Senator Cruz, every investigation I led as Intelligence Committee chairman followed proper congressional procedures. We pursued credible intelligence about foreign interference in our democratic processes." "Well, now that's mighty interesting," Cruz said, his voice carrying the anticipation of a Supreme Court advocate who had just felt a massive constitutional tug on his legal line. "Because I have some official findings here that might shed new light on just how credible your intelligence really was." Schiff's media-trained instincts kicked in as he prepared to deploy his well-rehearsed talking points about proper Intelligence Committee oversight and following established procedures for investigating foreign threats. "Senator Cruz, my work as Intelligence Committee chairman was guided by our constitutional duty to oversee the intelligence community and investigate threats to American national security." Schiff began, his voice gaining strength with each familiar phrase. "We followed proper protocols, consulted with career intelligence professionals, and pursued leads based on legitimate intelligence reporting." He gestured with practiced confidence, his tone taking on the condescending quality of a prosecutor addressing a jury of constitutional laymen. "What you're seeing here is simply the result of thorough congressional oversight conducted according to established Intelligence Committee procedures and constitutional principles." Several progressive activists in the gallery nodded supportively. MSNBC's cameras captured their approving expressions. This was the Adam Schiff they expected. Articulate, prosecutorial, completely in control of his investigative narrative. But Cruz sat quietly, occasionally making notes on his legal pad with the unhurried precision of someone who knew exactly where this constitutional examination was heading. His patient Texas smile never wavered, and somehow that made Schiff's confident performance seem less convincing to everyone watching. "Well, Mr. Schiff," Cruz said, reaching into his briefcase with the theatrical precision of a Supreme Court advocate about to perform his greatest constitutional argument. I sure do appreciate that inspiring story about proper procedures and constitutional duty. But you know what, I'm a constitutional lawyer, and constitutional lawyers like documented evidence. And I have some documented evidence here that tells a mighty different story. He pulled out a thick stack of official papers, each bearing federal seals and the signature of Special Counsel John Durham. The documents were arranged with prosecutorial precision, each one a piece of evidence in what was becoming clear was a comprehensive constitutional case against one of Washington's most powerful former committee chairmen. This here is the official report of Special Counsel John Durham, all 306 pages of it. Cruz explained, his voice taking on the authoritative tone of someone who had spent months studying every constitutional violation contained within its findings. He held up the first section, displaying it on the chamber's monitors for all America to see. Let's start with Mr. Durham's central conclusion about your Russia investigation, Mr. Schiff. The text appeared with devastating clarity. The FBI and Department of Justice failed to uphold their important mission of strict fidelity to the law when they opened Crossfire Hurricane in 2016. Neither U.S. law enforcement nor the intelligence community appears to have possessed any actual evidence of collusion in their holdings at the commencement of the investigation. Cruz paused, letting the implications sink into the consciousness of everyone in the chamber and the millions watching across America. No actual evidence, Mr. Schiff. None. Zero. According to the official investigation by a federal prosecutor with subpoena power. Cruz moved to a comprehensive presentation board that displayed the timeline of constitutional fraud with prosecutorial precision. But let's talk about the specific lies you told the American people, Mr. Schiff. Cruz continued, his voice rising with the moral authority of someone defending constitutional principles. This timeline shows something that should shock every American who believes in honest government. The board displayed a devastating chronological record. January 2017, FBI knows Steele dossier is unverified and likely Russian disinformation. March 2017, Schiff reads dossier allegations into congressional record. March 22, 2017, Schiff tells Chuck Todd on TV. There is more than circumstantial evidence now of Trump-Russia collusion. 2017-2019, Schiff makes 73-plus TV appearances claiming evidence exists. March 2019, Mueller report finds no criminal conspiracy. May 2023, Durham report confirms no basis for investigation ever existed. 73 television appearances. Mr. Schiff, yo. Cruz said, his voice carrying prosecutorial precision. 73 times you went on national television and told the American people that evidence of collusion existed. But according to Special Counsel Durham, you knew from the very beginning that no such evidence existed. Cruz turned to face Schiff directly. Mr. Schiff, you either committed systematic perjury or you knowingly deceived the American people for 3 years while using your position as Intelligence Committee Chairman to lend credibility to lies. Cruz reached for another section of the Durham report, this one marked with academic institution letterheads and documented threats against researchers. But the lies weren't enough for you, were they, Mr. Schiff? Cruz asked, his tone becoming more prosecutorial. You had to use the power of your congressional office to intimidate academic researchers into supporting your false narrative. The monitors displayed email communications and meeting notes that painted a picture of congressional abuse that would have made the Founding Fathers recoil in horror. According to Special Counsel Durham's investigation, your staff contacted university researchers and demanded their help with what you called the Trump-Russia matter. Cruz read from the official findings. When one researcher told your staff that it would be inappropriate for a public university to engage in partisan political research, your staffer responded, "We are now in charge." Cruz's voice rose with constitutional indignation. Mr. Schiff, you used the power of the United States Congress to threaten academic researchers into supporting your political narrative. That's not oversight. That's intimidation of American citizens using the power of their own government. The documentation was devastating. Meeting notes, email exchanges, and witness testimony all painted the same picture: a congressman using his intelligence committee position to pressure academics, researchers, and government officials into supporting false claims about a sitting president. Cruz opened his final section for this round, revealing sworn testimony and congressional records that demonstrated a pattern of lies under oath spanning multiple years. But let's talk about the legal consequences of what you've done, Mr. Schiff. Cruz said, his voice taking on the tone of a solicitor general who had spent his career prosecuting government corruption. He began displaying side-by-side comparisons of Schiff's sworn testimony with documented facts. The pattern was undeniable and legally devastating. Here's you testifying under oath that you had no prior contact with the whistleblower before his complaint was filed. Cruz read from official transcripts. And here's documented evidence from Special Counsel Durham showing that your staff met with the whistleblower multiple times before the complaint was submitted. The legal implications were staggering. Here's you testifying under oath that your Russia investigation was based on credible intelligence. And here's Special Counsel Durham's finding that no credible intelligence ever existed. Cruz's voice became cutting with constitutional precision. Mr. Schiff, perjury is a federal felony punishable by up to 5 years in prison. You've committed documented perjury at least 17 times that we can prove from official records. The first round was over. Cruz had systematically destroyed Schiff's claims of investigative integrity with official federal findings, documented evidence, and legal analysis that demonstrated a level of constitutional fraud so brazen it defied belief. But Cruz's expression as he reached for his second folder suggested that somehow impossibly the constitutional violations were about to get much worse. Round one's done, Mr. Schiff, he said with terrifying constitutional authority. But now we need to talk about how you turned impeachment into a constitutional crime and how you fabricated evidence against a sitting president of the United States. The 15-minute recess felt like an eternity for Adam Schiff. He huddled with his former Intelligence Committee staff in a side room, the confidence that had carried him through years of anti-Trump investigations, evaporating like morning dew under the Texas constitutional sun. Mr. Schiff, his former counsel whispered urgently, Cruz clearly has access to records we didn't know existed. The Durham material is more comprehensive than we anticipated. Absolutely not, Schiff hissed, though his voice lacked its usual prosecutorial authority. This is political theater designed to relitigate the impeachment. I can handle some Texas senator with Supreme Court fantasies. But deep down, Schiff knew something fundamental had changed. The Durham report evidenced the documented perjury, the systematic exposure of his false claims. It was all too precise, too devastating. Cruz hadn't stumbled onto this constitutional material. He'd been building a comprehensive case with the methodical precision of a Supreme Court advocate who never lost sight of constitutional principles. When the hearing reconvened, Cruz sat calmly at his table, a new folder placed prominently in front of him. This one was marked with House Judiciary Committee seals and impeachment proceeding documentation that seemed to pulse with constitutional significance. Senator Cruz, Chairman Rubio announced, "You may continue with your constitutional presentation." Cruz stood slowly, his movements deliberate and predatory, like a constitutional scholar who had found the perfect test case for everything wrong with modern impeachment proceedings. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, Mr. Schiff," he said, turning to face the former committee chairman directly, "let's talk about how you turn the sacred constitutional process of impeachment into a partisan weapon based on fabricated evidence." Cruz opened the folder with ceremonial precision, revealing transcripts from the September 26, 2019 impeachment hearing that would soon become evidence in what constitutional scholars would call the most brazen abuse of impeachment power in American history. Mr. Schiff, Article 1 of the Constitution gives the House of Representatives the sole power of impeachment. Cruz began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent his career studying the founding documents. The Founding Fathers designed impeachment as a solemn constitutional remedy for high crimes and misdemeanors that threaten the very foundations of our republic. The official transcript was displayed on the chamber's monitors with devastating clarity. Each word of Schiff's fabricated summary was highlighted, showing the stark contrast between what President Trump actually said and what Schiff told the American people he said. September 26, 2019. Cruz read from the official record. You opened the first impeachment hearing with what you called a summary of President Trump's phone call with Ukrainian President Zelensky. Cruz's voice became more pointed as he read Schiff's fabricated words. I want you to make up dirt on my political opponent, understand lots of it on this and on that. Those were your words, Mr. Schiff, presented to the American people as a summary of what their president said. Schiff's defense was immediate and desperate. Senator Cruz, that was clearly presented as a parody to illustrate the meaning and import of the president's words. Parody. Cruz's eyebrows raised with the theatrical precision that had made him famous in Supreme Court arguments. Mr. Schiff, show me where in Article 1 of the Constitution it says that impeachment managers are allowed to present parody as evidence in constitutional proceedings. Cruz moved to a sophisticated constitutional analysis that had been prepared by some of the nation's leading impeachment scholars. Mr. Schiff, let me explain the constitutional significance of what you did, Cruz said, his voice taking on the professorial tone of someone who had taught constitutional law and argued before the highest court in America. Impeachment is mentioned 6 times in the Constitution. 6 times the Founding Fathers felt it necessary to specify the procedures, the standards, and the protections that must govern this ultimate constitutional remedy, Cruz explained, displaying the relevant constitutional text. Nowhere, absolutely nowhere, do the Founding Fathers suggest that impeachment managers should be allowed to fabricate evidence present parody as fact or mislead the American people about what their president actually said. Cruz's voice rose with constitutional indignation that would be replayed millions of times across conservative media. What you did wasn't parody, Mr. Schiff. It was fraud. Constitutional fraud committed against the American people during the most solemn proceeding our system of government provides. Cruz reached for another section of evidence, this one containing timeline documentation that revealed the systematic coordination behind the impeachment complaint. But the fabricated evidence was just the beginning, wasn't it, Mr. Schiff? Cruz asked, his tone becoming more prosecutorial. You orchestrated the entire impeachment charade from start to finish, beginning with secret coordination with the so-called whistleblower. The timeline was displayed with devastating precision. July 25, 2019. Trump-Zelensky phone call occurs late July 2019. Schiff staff meets with prospective whistleblower. Multiple meetings documented August 12, 2019. Whistleblower complaint filed with specific legal language suggested by Schiff staff. September 9, 2019. Schiff tells public, we have not spoken directly with the whistleblower. Mr. Schiff, you lied to the American people about your contact with the whistleblower, Cruz said with prosecutorial precision. You orchestrated the complaint, coached the language, and then lied about your involvement to lend credibility to what was essentially a political operation disguised as a constitutional proceeding. Cruz moved to documentation showing how Schiff had corrupted the impeachment process itself by violating the constitutional rights of the minority party and denying due process to the president. But it gets worse, Mr. Schiff. Cruz continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who understood that constitutional procedures exist to protect all Americans, not just those in the majority party. The evidence was systematic and damning. 17 Republican witness requests denied without explanation. Secret depositions conducted without minority party participation. Selective leaking of testimony to friendly media outlets. Refusal to allow cross-examination of key witnesses, exclusion of exculpatory evidence from final report. Mr. Schiff, the Constitution doesn't just protect the rights of Democratic congressmen. Cruz said, his Texas drawl making the constitutional principles sound like common sense. Even in impeachment proceedings, due process matters, minority rights matter, truth matters. Cruz's voice became cutting. You turned impeachment into a Soviet-style show trial where the outcome was predetermined and the process was designed to destroy rather than discover truth. Cruz opened his final section for this round, revealing the official House resolution that would vindicate everything he was presenting to the American people. "But you know what, Mr. Schiff, you don't have to take my word for any of this," Cruz said, producing House Resolution 521 with the ceremonial precision of someone presenting ultimate constitutional evidence. June 21, 2023, your own colleagues in the House of Representatives voted 213 to 209 to officially censure you for your conduct as Intelligence Committee Chairman. The official resolution was displayed with devastating clarity, resolved that the House of Representatives censures Adam Schiff, representative of the 30th Congressional District of California, for misleading the American public and for conduct unbecoming of an elected member of the House of Representatives. Cruz's voice carried ultimate constitutional authority. "Mr. Schiff, this isn't partisan rhetoric. This is an official finding by the United States House of Representatives that you misled the American public and engaged in conduct unbecoming of an elected member." He continued reading from the official resolution. "The committee finds that Representative Schiff abused his trust by alleging he had evidence of collusion between Trump's campaign and Russia and engaged in falsehoods, misrepresentations, and abuses of sensitive information." Cruz turned to face Schiff directly. "Mr. Schiff, you are the first House member to be censured for lying about an investigation since the 1800s. Your own Democratic colleagues voted that you committed constitutional fraud against the American people." The second round was over. Cruz had systematically exposed Schiff's impeachment fraud with official congressional findings, constitutional analysis, and documented evidence of systematic abuse of the most sacred proceeding in American government. But as he reached for his third folder marked with Intelligence Committee seals and classified information handling protocols, his expression suggested that the constitutional crimes were merely preparation for something that threatened the very foundations of American national security. "Round two's done, Mr. Schiff," he said with terrifying constitutional calm. "But now we need to talk about how you turned America's most sensitive intelligence into a political weapon and how you committed federal crimes to destroy a sitting president." If Adam Schiff thought the impeachment fraud revelations were devastating, he was about to learn that Ted Cruz was just getting warmed up. The constitutional scholar from Texas reached for his third folder, this one bearing Intelligence Committee seals and federal classification markings that seemed to pulse with the weight of national security crimes that were about to be exposed to constitutional scrutiny. "Mr. Schiff," Cruz began, his voice carrying new gravitas that filled the chamber with constitutional authority, "if you think constitutional fraud is serious, you're about to learn what happens when someone uses America's most classified intelligence as a political weapon against a sitting president." Schiff's remaining composure was cracking under the systematic constitutional pressure, but he seemed unable to comprehend the legal magnitude of what was about to be revealed. His eyes were fixed on Cruz with the intensity of someone watching his own constitutional execution being carried out with Supreme Court precision. Cruz stood and moved to the center of the chamber, holding both his pocket constitution and the official Intelligence Committee oath that every member swears before gaining access to America's most sensitive secrets. "Mr. Schiff, before we examine your systematic abuse of classified information, let's remind the American people of the sacred oath you took as a member of the House Intelligence Committee." Cruz said, his Texas drawl making the constitutional principles sound like fundamental American values. Cruz began reciting from memory, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that constitutional oaths are sacred commitments, not political conveniences. "I do solemnly swear that I will not disclose any classified information received in the course of my service on the Intelligence Committee, except as authorized by the committee or House of Representatives." He paused, letting the words sink into the consciousness of everyone watching. "I further swear that I will not use my position on the Intelligence Committee for personal or political advantage, and that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution and laws of the United States." Cruz's eyes bore into Schiff with constitutional intensity. "True faith and allegiance, Mr. Schiff? Not to your political party, not to your hatred of Donald Trump, to the Constitution and the laws you swore to uphold." Cruz opened his evidence folder and began displaying a timeline that would shock Americans who believed their intelligence agencies were above political manipulation. But you didn't just break that oath, Mr. Schiff. Cruz continued, his voice taking on the prosecutorial authority of someone who had spent his career holding government officials accountable to constitutional standards. You turned America's Intelligence Committee into a political opposition research operation. The timeline was displayed with devastating precision. January 15, 2018, classified briefing on FISA applications. Schiff receives sensitive information January 15, 2018, 4:47 p.m. CNN breaks exclusive story containing classified details from morning briefing. February 3, 2018, classified briefing on FBI surveillance methods. Schiff in attendance. February 3, 2018, 6:23 p.m. MSNBC reports exclusive details matching classified briefing content, March 12, 2018, classified briefing on ongoing investigations, Schiff present, March 12, 2018, 8:15 p.m. Washington Post publishes scoop with information from classified session. 47 documented instances, Mr. Schiff. Cruz said, his voice rising with constitutional indignation. 47 times you attended classified briefings, and 47 times sensitive information from those briefings appeared in friendly media outlets within hours. Cruz turned to address the cameras directly. Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't coincidence. This is systematic abuse of classified information by someone who used his Intelligence Committee position to wage political warfare against a sitting president. Cruz moved to a comprehensive legal analysis that had been prepared by former federal prosecutors and constitutional scholars. Mr. Schiff, let me explain the federal crimes you committed in terms that every American can understand. Cruz said, his voice taking on the tone of a solicitor general who had spent his career prosecuting government corruption. He moved to a whiteboard and began writing federal statutes with the precision of someone who had argued constitutional law before the Supreme Court. 18 U.S.C. Section 798, unauthorized disclosure of classified information. Maximum penalty, 10 years, federal prison. U.S.C. Section 6401, theft of government property, classified information. Maximum penalty, 10 years. Federal prison, 18 U.S.C. FARA 371, conspiracy to defraud the United States, maximum penalty. 5 years federal prison. Those are federal felonies, Mr. Schiff, Cruz said, his voice carrying ultimate constitutional authority, each carrying penalties that would send ordinary Americans to federal prison for decades. But somehow you seem to think your political position put you above the law. Cruz produced evidence of what federal prosecutors would later describe as a systematic criminal enterprise designed to monetize classified information for political purposes. But it gets worse, Mr. Schiff. Cruz continued, his tone becoming more serious as he revealed the scope of the constitutional crimes. You didn't just leak classified information, you built a criminal enterprise around it. And the financial documentation was staggering. MSNBC contributor contract $15,000 month retainer for exclusive intelligence insights. CNN consultation fees, $5,000 per appearance for Russia expertise. Speaking fees at universities, $50,000 plus per event for the national security analysis. Book advance $1.2 million for insider perspective on Trump investigations. Mr. Schiff, you turned classified information into personal income, Cruz said, his voice heavy with constitutional disgust. You monetized America's national security secrets to build your personal brand and enrich yourself. Cruz's analysis was devastating. Every television appearance, every paid speech, every book deal was based on classified information you swore to protect. You committed federal crimes and then profited from those crimes. Cruz activated a secure video connection that had been established for intelligence community testimony. Ladies and gentlemen, Cruz announced, due to national security requirements, our next witness will testify via secure connection about the damage Mr. Schiff's leaks caused to American intelligence operations. The monitor displayed a figure in shadow with voice modulation to protect their identity. I am a senior intelligence officer with the Central Intelligence Agency. I am authorized to testify about the operational damage caused by unauthorized disclosures from the House Intelligence Committee during Mr. Schiff's chairmanship. The testimony was devastating. Mr. Schiff's systematic leaking of classified information compromised at least 12 ongoing intelligence operations, forced the withdrawal of 3 intelligence assets from hostile countries, and resulted in the exposure of intelligence methods that took decades to develop. The human cost was staggering. 2 intelligence officers operating under non-official cover were compromised and had to be extracted from hostile territory as a direct result of information that appeared in media reports sourced to Intelligence Committee leaks. Cruz's voice was heavy with moral weight. Mr. Schiff, you put American intelligence officers' lives at risk to score political points against President Trump. You compromised national security to feed your political ambitions. Cruz moved to his final presentation for this round, displaying the constitutional framework that makes Intelligence Committee membership such a sacred trust. Mr. Schiff, the Constitution gives Congress the power and responsibility to oversee intelligence activities, Cruz said, holding up Article 1 of the Constitution. But that power comes with the solemn responsibility to protect the very secrets that keep America safe. His voice became professorial, the tone of someone who had spent his career studying the delicate balance between congressional oversight and national security. The Founding Fathers designed our system to ensure that Congress could hold the executive branch accountable while protecting sensitive information that enemies could use to harm America. Cruz's voice rose to constitutional crescendo. But you perverted that sacred constitutional responsibility. You turned intelligence oversight into political warfare. You used America's most sensitive secrets as ammunition in your personal war against Donald Trump. The third round was over. Cruz had systematically exposed Schiff's systematic abuse of classified information with federal law citations, intelligence community testimony, and constitutional analysis that demonstrated crimes so serious they threatened the very foundations of American national security. But as he reached for his 4th folder marked with financial disclosure forms and ethics violation documentation, his expression suggested that even federal crimes were merely preparation for the ultimate revelation of how personal enrichment had corrupted constitutional duty. "Round 3's done, Mr. Schiff," he said with terrifying constitutional calm. "But now we need to talk about how you turned constitutional fraud into personal wealth and how you built a criminal enterprise on the foundation of lies to the American people." The chamber had taken on the atmosphere of a federal courtroom where white-collar criminals were being exposed for systematically defrauding the American people. Adam Schiff sat motionless, his expensive suit now wrinkled with perspiration, his eyes vacant and staring at some internal sanctuary where the mounting evidence of his criminal enterprise couldn't reach him. But Cruz wasn't finished. The constitutional scholar from Texas reached for his 4th folder marked with financial disclosure forms and ethics violation documentation that seemed to pulse with the weight of systematic corruption that had turned constitutional duty into personal profit. "Mr. Schiff," Cruz began, his voice carrying the sacred authority of someone exposing the ultimate betrayal of public trust. "Everything we've discussed today, the Russia lies, the impeachment fraud, the classified information crimes, all of it was designed to serve one ultimate purpose: enriching yourself at the expense of the American people you swore to serve." Cruz's eyes bore into Schiff with the intensity of a solicitor general seeking justice for the highest crimes against constitutional government. "We're about to talk about how you turned constitutional fraud into a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise." Cruz stood and moved to a comprehensive financial analysis that had been prepared by former federal prosecutors specializing in public corruption cases. "Mr. Schiff, let's start with your book deal," Cruz said, displaying contracts and financial records that painted a picture of systematic profiteering from constitutional fraud. The documentation was damning beyond belief. Midnight in Washington contract $1.2 million advance from Random House publication date October 2021. Content false. Claims about Trump-Russia collusion timeline. Published while Schiff still claimed evidence existed before Durham report proved all claims false. "Mr. Schiff, you received $1.2 million from Random House to write a book promoting the very lies that Special Counsel Durham proved were false," Cruz said, his voice carrying prosecutorial precision. You monetized constitutional fraud and sold it to the American people as truth. Cruz displayed excerpts from the book that contained claims Durham had definitively debunked. Every chapter, every claim, every allegation was based on information you knew was false when you wrote it. You committed literary fraud for personal enrichment. Cruz moved to evidence showing how Schiff had built a nationwide speaking operation based entirely on false claims about intelligence and constitutional principles. But the book deal was just the beginning of your criminal enterprise, wasn't it, Mr. Schiff? Cruz asked, his tone becoming more prosecutorial as he revealed the scope of the constitutional crimes. The speaking engagement documentation was comprehensive. University of California, Berkeley, $55,000 for defending democracy from authoritarianism. Harvard Kennedy School, $60,000 for constitutional oversight in the Trump era. Georgetown Law Center, $45,000 for Intelligence Committee leadership during constitutional crisis. Yale Law School, $50,000 for prosecutorial integrity in political investigations. Over $800,000 in speaking fees since 2017. Cruz said, his voice rising with constitutional indignation. Every single speech was based on false claims about Russia collusion that you knew were lies when you delivered them. Cruz's analysis was devastating. You traveled to America's most prestigious universities and lied to students about constitutional principles while enriching yourself through fraud. You corrupted legal education itself with your criminal enterprise. Cruz opened another section revealing what federal prosecutors would classify as a systematic money laundering operation designed to convert constitutional fraud into legitimate income. But speaking fees weren't enough for you, were they, Mr. Schiff? Cruz continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had prosecuted similar criminal enterprises as Solicitor General. The media contracts were revealed with devastating precision. MSNBC contributor contract, $15,000 month retainer for exclusive intelligence analysis. CNN consultation agreement, $5,000 per appearance for Russia investigation expertise. Premium speaking rate, $75,000 plus for insider perspective on Trump investigations. Media appearance. Total over $2 million in documented payments since 2017. Mr. Schiff, you built a media empire on the foundation of lies. Cruz said, his voice heavy with constitutional disgust. Every television appearance, every expert consultation, every insider analysis was based on false information you knew was fraudulent. Cruz's legal analysis was comprehensive. You used your Intelligence Committee position to gain access to classified information, leaked that information to build credibility, then monetize that fraudulent credibility through media contracts. That's racketeering under federal law. Cruz moved to his most damaging evidence documentation showing how Schiff had used constitutional fraud as the foundation for a massive political fundraising operation. But the ultimate goal of your criminal enterprise wasn't just personal enrichment, was it, Mr. Schiff? Cruz asked, his voice taking on the tone of someone revealing the scope of political corruption that threatened democratic institutions themselves. The campaign finance documentation was staggering. Total Senate campaign fundraising, $32.4 million raised since 2021. Fundraising appeals, 47 emails citing Trump investigation experience. Donor basis. Small donors contributing based on false Russia claims. Average donation, $47 from working Americans who believe Schiff's lies. Mr. Schiff, you raised over $32 million for your Senate campaign by lying to working Americans about your Intelligence Committee work. Cruz said, his voice carrying ultimate constitutional authority. Families sent you their hard-earned money because they believed you were a truth-teller who had exposed presidential corruption. Cruz's moral condemnation was devastating. Instead, you were a constitutional criminal who had built your entire political career on systematic fraud against the very people you claim to serve. Cruz moved to his final presentation for this round, creating a comprehensive summary of ethics violations that demonstrated how constitutional fraud had corrupted every aspect of Schiff's public service. "Let me summarize the criminal enterprise you built on constitutional fraud," Cruz said, moving to a whiteboard where he began listing violations with the precision of someone who had spent months consulting with federal prosecutors and ethics experts. Constitutional crimes, systematic perjury in congressional testimony, abuse of classified information for personal gain, fraud in congressional investigations, racketeering through media enterprises, campaign finance fraud through false representations, financial crimes, money laundering through speaking engagements, wire fraud through media contracts, mail fraud through book publishing, tax fraud through unreported criminal income, ethics violations, abuse of congressional position for personal enrichment, violation of Intelligence Committee oath, misuse of taxpayer resources for personal business, conflict of interest in media relationships. "This isn't political disagreement, Mr. Schiff," Cruz said, his voice carrying ultimate constitutional authority. "This is systematic criminal activity designed to defraud the American people while enriching yourself through constitutional fraud." Cruz's voice reached a crescendo of constitutional indignation that would be replayed millions of times across social media and conservative outlets. "You turned public service into personal profit. You used constitutional principles as raw material for criminal enterprises. You betrayed every oath you ever took while enriching yourself at the expense of American democracy." The fourth round was over. Cruz had systematically exposed Schiff's criminal enterprise with financial documentation, legal analysis, and moral authority that demonstrated corruption so comprehensive it threatened the very foundations of constitutional government. But as he reached for his final folder, the expression on his face suggested that even criminal enterprises were merely preparation for the ultimate constitutional confrontation between truth and lies, oath and betrayal, constitutional principle, and political corruption. "Round four's done, Mr. Schiff," he said with terrifying constitutional calm. "But now we need to have the final conversation about accountability consequences and what happens when constitutional justice finally catches up with decades of fraud against the American people." The hearing room had transcended political theater and become something approaching a moment of constitutional reckoning that would be studied in law schools for generations. Adam Schiff sat like a broken statue, his mind seemingly retreated to some internal sanctuary where the mounting evidence of his systematic constitutional crimes couldn't reach him. The man who had wielded investigative power with prosecutorial arrogance for years had been reduced to a hollow shell by the methodical constitutional destruction delivered by a Texas lawyer with Supreme Court credentials and an unshakable commitment to constitutional principles. But Cruz wasn't finished. The constitutional scholar from Texas stood for his final presentation, holding both his pocket constitution and the complete evidence of systematic fraud that would end one of the most powerful political careers in Washington and restore faith in constitutional accountability. "Mr. Schiff," Cruz began, his voice carrying the sacred authority of someone delivering constitutional justice after years of fraud had gone unpunished. "We've covered a lot of constitutional ground today. Systematic lies about Russia collusion, impeachment fraud based on fabricated evidence, federal crimes involving classified information, a criminal enterprise built on constitutional fraud that enriched you while betraying the American people." Cruz's eyes bore into Schiff with the intensity of a constitutional scholar who had spent months building an airtight case against the most systematic abuse of congressional power in modern American history. "But now we need to talk about the ultimate question that every American is asking. What are the consequences when someone systematically betrays their constitutional oath and commits federal crimes against the very people they swore to serve?" Schiff summoned what remained of his prosecutorial instincts for one final desperate attempt to destroy his constitutional tormentor through personal attack rather than address the overwhelming evidence of his criminal enterprise. "Senator Cruz," he began, his voice shaking with desperation and barely controlled rage, You're just a failed presidential candidate from Texas trying to relitigate the 2016 election and seeking revenge for a successful impeachment inquiry that exposed Donald Trump's constitutional crimes. His voice gained strength as he fell back on the identity politics playbook that had served him throughout his career. This entire hearing is nothing but partisan retaliation designed to distract from Trump's documented abuse of power and to silence the truth-tellers who had the courage to hold him accountable. He gestured wildly, his prosecutorial composure completely shattered. You don't understand modern constitutional challenges or the complexities of intelligence oversight in the 21st century. You represent everything that's wrong with conservative politics, blind loyalty to Trump, and refusal to accept the legitimate results of congressional investigations. The remaining liberal reporters in the gallery began taking notes furiously, hoping that Schiff's personal attack might somehow shift the narrative away from the devastating constitutional evidence that had been presented. I've dedicated my career to defending democracy, protecting national security, and upholding constitutional principles. Schiff continued, his voice becoming more shrill with each word. And you're trying to destroy me because you can't handle the idea of effective congressional oversight that actually holds presidents accountable for constitutional violations. Cruz waited patiently for Schiff's tantrum to end, his Texas gentleman demeanor never wavering even in the face of desperate personal attacks. When Schiff finally finished, he adjusted his glasses with the calm precision of someone who had just watched his opponent's complete constitutional suicide. "Well now, Mr. Schiff," Cruz began his Texas drawl, carrying new authority after witnessing the complete breakdown of a man who had claimed constitutional high ground. "I appreciate you sharing your thoughts on my motivations and my understanding of constitutional principles. But you know what? This isn't about me, and it sure isn't about Donald Trump." His voice began to rise with the moral authority of someone defending constitutional principles against systematic fraud. "This is about your systematic violation of every constitutional oath you ever took. This is about your betrayal of the American people who trusted you with their most sacred governmental institutions." Cruz moved closer to Schiff, his voice carrying the weight of constitutional judgment that would echo through American history. "You want to talk about constitutional principles? Let's talk about the constitutional principle that says no one, absolutely no one, is above the law regardless of their political position or their claims of moral authority." His voice became cutting with constitutional precision. "You want to talk about defending democracy? Let's talk about how you turned America's Intelligence Committee into a political weapon. You want to talk about upholding constitutional principles? Let's talk about how you fabricated evidence in impeachment proceedings." Cruz's voice reached a crescendo of constitutional indignation that would be studied by future generations of constitutional scholars. "And you want to talk about holding presidents accountable? Let's talk about how you enriched yourself through systematic fraud while claiming to serve the American people." Cruz moved to a massive presentation board that had been prepared for this final moment, a comprehensive visual summary of every piece of constitutional evidence presented during the hearing. "Ladies and gentlemen," Cruz announced, addressing both the chamber and the millions of Americans watching, "what we have documented here today represents the most systematic abuse of congressional power and violation of constitutional principles in modern American history." The board displayed a timeline spanning from 2016 to 2024, showing the progression of Schiff's constitutional crimes from simple lies to systematic fraud to criminal enterprises that threaten the very foundations of American government. 73 false claims about Russia collusion based on information he knew was fabricated. Cruz read from the comprehensive evidence summary. Systematic perjury and congressional testimony spanning multiple years, impeachment fraud including fabricated evidence presented to the American people. Cruz's voice carried the weight of someone who had spent months building a constitutional case that would transform American understanding of congressional accountability. Federal crimes involving classified information that compromised national security operations. A criminal enterprise that generated over $3.2 million in personal income through constitutional fraud. Nay. Cruz moved to his final presentation, holding photographs and documentation representing the Americans whose faith in constitutional government had been betrayed by Schiff's systematic fraud. "I want to show you some people, Mr. Schiff," Cruz said, displaying images of families, workers, and citizens who represented the Americans that congressional fraud betrayed every day. "This is the Martinez family from Arizona," Cruz began, his voice heavy with moral weight. "Maria Martinez works as a school teacher while her husband serves in the Army. They donated $25 to your Senate campaign because they believed you were a truth teller who had exposed presidential corruption." Cruz's voice became more pointed. "Their donation was based on lies, Mr. Schiff. Constitutional lies that you knew were false when you solicited their hard-earned money." He continued with more examples. "This is Robert Chen from Michigan. He's a small business owner who sent you $50 because he believed your claims about defending democracy and constitutional principles. This is Sarah Williams from North Carolina. She's a nurse who donated $35 to your campaign because she thought you were protecting America from foreign interference." Cruz's voice reached ultimate moral authority. "These are the Americans you betrayed, Mr. Schiff. These are the people whose trust you violated, whose money you took through fraud, whose faith in constitutional government you destroyed through systematic deception." The accumulated weight of constitutional evidence, legal analysis, and moral condemnation finally broke what remained of Adam Schiff's political composure. The man who had dominated Trump-era politics for years began to hyperventilate, clutching the table for support as the reality of his complete constitutional exposure sank in. His former staff members were frantically trying to coordinate some kind of damage control response, but they realized that no amount of political maneuvering could address the scope of constitutional crimes and criminal enterprise that had been systematically documented. Social media exploded with hashtags that told the story of a constitutional justice finally delivered, #Schiff, exposed, #Cruz, constitutional, hero/constitutional, justice, and #drain. These swamp-dominated trending topics worldwide with unprecedented engagement numbers that crashed multiple platforms. Schiff was unable to respond coherently to the constitutional evidence, his years of political experience completely inadequate to address the systematic constitutional case that Cruz had built against him. Cruz stood for his final words holding his pocket constitution, like a sacred text that had been vindicated against years of political corruption and constitutional fraud. "Ladies and gentlemen," Cruz said, his voice carrying the satisfied authority of someone who had delivered constitutional justice. "What we've witnessed here today is what accountability looks like when someone finally has the courage to hold corrupt politicians responsible for their crimes against constitutional principles." The chamber erupted in a standing ovation that lasted over 20 minutes as Americans across the country watched constitutional principles triumph over political corruption. Gallery members, C-SPAN viewers, and social media audiences witnessed a moment of constitutional justice that restored faith in American institutions. "In America, no one is above the law," Cruz continued as the applause continued. "Not even Intelligence Committee chairmen who think their political power makes them untouchable. Not even impeachment managers who believe they can fabricate evidence without consequences. Nay." Cruz calmly packed his briefcase as the ovation continued, his demeanor that of someone who had simply fulfilled his constitutional duty rather than delivered one of the most devastating political destructions in American history. "The Constitution still works when constitutional scholars have the courage to defend it," Cruz said in his closing words that would echo through American political history. "Mr. Schiff, you picked the wrong constitutional lawyer to attack." Class dismissed. As Cruz walked out of the chamber, Adam Schiff sat motionless. His political career effectively ended by a Texas lawyer who had proven that constitutional principles, Supreme Court credentials, and systematic evidence could still triumph over years of Washington corruption. The man who had weaponized impeachment against a sitting president had been brought down by a constitutional scholar with a briefcase full of evidence and an unshakable commitment to constitutional justice. Within minutes of Adam Schiff's complete constitutional destruction at the hands of Ted Cruz, the American political landscape was forever altered. The footage of the former Intelligence Committee chairman sitting motionless while a Texas constitutional scholar systematically exposed years of fraud became the most viral political content in Internet history, surpassing 200 million views in its first 48 hours. The video clips of Cruz's most devastating constitutional moments, his Supreme Court credentials reveal the Durham Report nuclear bomb, the systematic constitutional case building, and his final moral reckoning, were shared across every social media platform with engagement numbers that broke previous records for political content. CNN and MSNBC, longtime Schiff allies who had provided platforms for his false Russia claims for years, found themselves in an impossible position. The evidence Cruz had presented was so comprehensive, so well-documented, and so legally devastating that even the most partisan commentators couldn't dismiss it as political theater. This represents perhaps the most thorough exposure of congressional corruption in modern American history, Anderson Cooper acknowledged during emergency coverage. The constitutional evidence presented by Senator Cruz appears irrefutable and demonstrates a level of systematic fraud that threatens public faith in congressional institutions. Democratic Party leadership went into complete crisis mode as the implications of Schiff's exposure spread throughout their ranks. If the party's most prominent Trump critic had been systematically lying about intelligence for years, how many other Democratic politicians might be similarly compromised by constitutional fraud emergency? Meetings were called as party officials realized that Schiff's constitutional crimes were so extensive, so well documented that any attempts to defend him would destroy their own credibility with voters who now understood the scope of systematic deception. Within 72 hours, every major Democratic leader had issued statements distancing themselves from Schiff and calling for complete accountability for any violations of constitutional principles and public trust. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries announced his immediate withdrawal of support for Schiff's Senate campaign, stating, "The constitutional evidence presented requires us to reevaluate our confidence in anyone who may have systematically misled the American people about matters of national security." The progressive movement that had built much of its Trump-era identity around Schiff's Russia claims immediately collapsed as younger politicians scrambled to avoid association with what was now understood to be systematic constitutional fraud. Senator Ted Cruz's approval ratings soared to heights never before recorded in modern American polling. Within 96 hours of the constitutional hearing, his approval rating reached 91% nationally, including 73% approval among registered Democrats who recognized the constitutional principles he had defended. Cruz for Supreme Court justice movements spontaneously erupted across the country with organizational capabilities that surprised even seasoned political observers. Constitutional law societies reported unprecedented interest in Cruz's methodology, with law schools across America requesting lectures on constitutional accountability. Constitutional law schools immediately began incorporating Cruz's systematic destruction of Schiff into their curricula as the gold standard for constitutional advocacy and systematic evidence presentation. Harvard Law School announced the creation of the Cruz Constitutional Accountability Fellowship to train future lawyers in the methodical approach he had demonstrated. Cruz himself remained characteristically humble about his role in exposing the constitutional fraud. During a press conference at the Texas state capitol, his response to Supreme Court speculation captured the constitutional principles that had made him a national hero. "I didn't do this for political advancement. I did it because the Constitution demands that we hold all government officials accountable to their oath, regardless of their party, their position, or their political connections." Publishers immediately began bidding wars for Cruz's account of the constitutional investigation, with the winning bid of $12 million being donated entirely to establish the Constitutional Accountability Foundation to support investigations into government corruption and provide legal defense for constitutional whistleblowers. Adam Schiff's political career, which had spanned over 2 decades and included historic moments as impeachment manager, was effectively ended in a single constitutional hearing. Within a week, he had suspended his Senate campaign, resigned from all committee positions, and faced calls for expulsion from Congress. The criminal enterprise that had generated millions through constitutional fraud began to collapse as speaking engagements were canceled. Media contracts were terminated and federal investigations were launched into every aspect of his financial operations. His book Midnight in Washington was withdrawn from publication as Random House faced potential fraud liability for publishing content based on systematic lies. The $1.2 million advance was demanded back as evidence mounted that the book constituted literary fraud. The mansion that had symbolized Schiff's power and influence became a symbol of constitutional corruption as protesters gathered daily outside its gates. Local California officials, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal, began removing Schiff's name from buildings and programs that had been established in his honor. Cruz's systematic exposure of Schiff's constitutional fraud triggered the largest congressional investigation in American history. Within 2 weeks, Special Prosecutor Robert Hur announced simultaneous investigations into 23 members of Congress who had demonstrated similar patterns of intelligence abuse or systematic deception about constitutional matters. The intelligence community underwent its most comprehensive reform since its creation after World War II. New protocols were established to prevent future political abuse of classified information, and dozens of officials who had failed to detect Schiff's systematic violations were removed from sensitive positions. Most significantly, public trust in constitutional government began to be restored for the first time in decades. Polling showed that Americans finally believed their constitutional system could hold corrupt officials accountable when principled leaders had the courage to defend founding principles. 6 months after the hearing that saved American constitutional government from systematic fraud, Cruz was invited to address a joint session of Congress. His speech, watched by over 280 million Americans, became known as the Constitutional Restoration Address and defined American political discourse for a generation. My fellow Americans, Cruz concluded that historic evening, his Texas drawl carrying across the chamber where he had delivered constitutional justice. What we learned from exposing congressional fraud is that the Constitution works exactly as the Founding Fathers intended. When government officials betray their oath, when they commit systematic fraud against the people they were sworn to serve, the Constitution provides the tools to hold them accountable. The price of constitutional liberty is eternal vigilance. He continued, quoting the founders who had designed the system he had just used to deliver justice. Sometimes that vigilance requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about people we trusted with power, but that's the responsibility of citizenship in a constitutional republic. As for Adam Schiff, federal investigations were launched into his documented violations, though as of this writing, legal proceedings remain ongoing. The evidence presented by Cruz sparked widespread calls for accountability and reform of congressional oversight processes. The systematic exposure of deception in intelligence matters led to comprehensive reforms designed to prevent future abuse of classified information and ensure greater transparency in congressional investigations. But Cruz's constitutional legacy lived on. The Texas scholar who had defended the Constitution against systematic deception became a symbol of what America could be when principled leaders had the courage to hold government accountable to its founding principles. Constitutional accountability had been demonstrated, truth had been defended against systematic deception, and America was reminded that the Constitution still works when constitutional scholars have the courage to defend it against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Smash that like. If constitutional accountability was demonstrated, subscribe for more constitutional truth that exposes Washington deception. Hit that bell, because when real constitutional scholars defend America, constitutional principles win. The constitutional republic the founders created had been strengthened by this demonstration of accountability, and Ted Cruz had proved that in America, constitutional principles matter no matter how powerful someone's political position or how systematic their deception.